Thanks for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Christina Evans. Let's continue on with these top stories that we're following. This next one is going to be taking us overseas. You may have heard some of those conversations that are happening as President Trump has been answering several questions in the last few days and weeks as it pertains to Greenland. We're showing you some vantage points, some pictures there of the island. We do know that just yesterday, President Trump continued to press for U.S. control of Greenland, telling reporters, quote, "We are going to do something on Greenland, whether they like it or not," saying that if we don't, Russia or China will be able to take over the island. This came as President Trump was sitting at that round table with oil executives at the White House to discuss investments in Venezuela. The president has repeatedly said that he wants to take over Greenland either by buying the autonomous island territory or by using military force. And to talk a lot more about what we're seeing there with the president, some of his motivation, and what potentially is going to happen ahead of the Trump administration meeting with some of these Danish leaders next week, I want to bring in political analyst Brian Sobel. Brian, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox.
Good to see you, Christina.
All right, it's a lot to unpack here as it pertains to Greenland. We know that this is not a new conversation. President Trump has been very vocal over his last administration as well, speaking about the importance of Greenland. But I first want to get with you just to sort of level set. Can you sort of explain to people how Greenland is set up? It is an autonomous nation, but it's also somewhat controlled and working with the Danish government as well. Can you sort of get into that initially so people can get an idea of how that politically goes?
Sure. To level set, first of all, Greenland is an autonomous territory of the Kingdom of Denmark. And Greenland, when you look at Greenland on a flat map, it looks very, very large. It is, but it's got a population, Christina, of about 58,000 people. So from a population standpoint, not very large. It is about 25% larger than our largest state, which is Alaska. And it was an important post during World War II because it sits between the United States and the Arctic, and therefore is in an area where it would have and does have some Russian influence and some Chinese influence. And currently we have one listening post there that is run by the Space Force, United States Space Force, for the purposes of monitoring missile activity and potential attacks from Russia or China. So all in all, it's an interesting place, mostly ice, or much of it ice, and not really inhabitable. And there's a picture of the space base. But in any case, I think Donald Trump is of the mind that because it's a very important territory in terms of national defense, that he wants to make a deal with the Danes on it. And by the way, here's an interesting thing to know. The residents of Greenland would be very happy to be their own country and would like to have sovereignty. About 85% of them in a recent poll said, we'd rather not be aligned with Denmark. We're happy to be our own country. So these are all things in the mix. But at the core of it, Donald Trump sees it as one more piece of a protection ring for the United States, which includes, as we see in Latin America and other places.
I'm glad you brought that up, Brian, just the history of it being involved as an important post in world wars in the past as well. But you brought up something there about the Greenlanders themselves. We do know that Greenland's leadership is now pushing back on President Trump and then the administration call for the U.S. to take control of the island. In fact, we heard from the Greenland Prime Minister and four party leaders. They released a statement just last night, according to Fox News, saying we don't want to be Americans. We don't want to be Danes. We want to be Greenlanders. And so I have to ask you, when it comes to what the dynamic is right now, even between Greenland and the Danish people, where do they stand? This sort of agreement that the two countries have, how has it been so strong for over 100 years at this point? And what is really keeping Greenland tied to the Danish nation?
Well, I think the Danes have controlled Greenland, and to the extent that it's been a benign sort of relationship, they have gone along with it. Denmark has three of these autonomous territories, Greenland being one of them. And so it's just been going on for a lot of years. But as you point out, and we did read those statements, Greenland wants to be its own country. Greenland, by the way, is protected by NATO. And so that is a factor as well. You heard one of the Danish ministers saying that if the United States were to take possession of Greenland, it would be the end of NATO. Well, I don't know about that, but I think the rhetoric from Donald Trump is to somehow find, and no surprise here, a deal on Greenland, but again, as you point out, and we know, the Greenlander people want to have their own country. And again, 58,000 people, so it's not very big, but they want their own governance, their own autonomy. They speak their own language, as a matter of fact, Greenlandic. And so it's been this large place in recent world history for many, many years, and they want their independence.
You're right. And so you also mentioned the several bases that are there under the U.S. government. In fact, the U.S. has had access to Greenland. This was under the 1951 Defense Agreement. Yes. And Denmark and Greenland would say that they would continue to be quite happy at the time to accommodate a beefed up American military presence. And so when it comes to what's next, President Trump, very vocal. We know that Secretary of State Marco Rubio is set to have some of these conversations with Danish leaders next week. Well, how is the administration going to focus on these talks? How are they going to approach them? Is it going to be from a buying standpoint, or may we see some of those pushes in there, as you've mentioned, the conversation around possible military action to obtain the island?
Yeah, I don't see the military action at all, Christina. I think this is Donald Trump doing what Donald Trump does, which is try to push the envelope as far as he can and then kind of back off it and say, hey, really, this is a transaction. This is like the Louisiana Purchase from France or something. And it's that's a transaction. That's a deal. The problem is, if there's a problem, is that it would be a three-party transaction. I mean, you've got the Danes, of course, who have control of Greenland, but you have the Greenland people. And so somehow this deal would have to include a real change for the Greenlandic people and Greenlanders, and for something that benefits the Kingdom of Denmark. That's what Marco Rubio will be speaking with the Danish folks about, to see whether there's a quote-unquote deal in there someplace.
And so as we're looking ahead as well here, Brian, that conversation is obviously going to be very important. But overall, we were hearing there, as President Trump was answering the question and answer session of the meeting that he had, that round table with oil executives talking about Venezuela. There have been a lot of influences on that conversation, and also putting that in with Greenland, saying that the U.S. did decide to take some sort of military action that did change the course of how Venezuela is being governed, wondering if that would possibly happen. Can you sort of, again, you just said that you don't think the military action is going to happen, but why are these two conversations coming together at this time?
Because I think the world's looking at the United States and frankly wondering what the plan is. I think they understand that Donald Trump, who says and does what he says he'll do, is putting a protective ring essentially around the United States in Latin America, and now you're hearing about it in Greenland, where he worries, and we should all worry about Russian and Chinese influence there. And he is saying, hey, we need to have a wider ring to protect the United States. And, you know, the world's getting smaller and smaller. And so I think his calculus is then you move the lines out further to create a larger ring. Now, it's also true that, you know, Russia sits across the straits from Alaska, so they're pretty close to us there, and in other places around the world. But I think to the extent that some place may be in play. Greenland would be one place that would be in play because it's so desolate in so many ways. Again, a very small population, a protectorate or a territory of the Kingdom of Denmark, which is really far away from Greenland, and it kind of harkens back to hundreds of years ago, where the industrialized nations of the world basically colonized many places around the world. And there aren't many of those left, but Greenland is one of them.
I'm glad you brought up that sort of history that we also see. But again, President Trump did reiterate Russia and China's influence. Have they signaled at any point that they were willing to come into the island nation and possibly take over as well?
No, I don't think that as much as being around the island, stopping, working with the Greenlanders to port their ships there. All of this is a concern that I think Donald Trump is trying to get out in front of. He wants to cut off that. He also wants to establish, I think, several bases there, which would be part of a security force in that part of the world. It's sort of like we're in a very dynamic spot right now, Christina, as everybody knows. You've got the Venezuelan situation, which may impact Colombia, which may impact and probably is going to impact Cuba. So you've got all of that at play. You have the Iranian uprising right now. So you have a Middle Eastern situation going on. You've got Donald Trump's interest in closing Greenland off from the Russians and the Chinese. The president has his hands full, and I'm sure it's keeping Marco Rubio and the State Department quite busy.
And we've also heard from White House Deputy Chief of Staff of Policy, Stephen Miller, doubling down on President Trump's remarks, saying this week that the United States is the power of NATO. For the United States to secure the Arctic region and to protect and defend NATO and NATO interests, obviously Greenland should be a part of the United States. And so there's a lot to unpack as we're going to continue to monitor this situation. Brian, any final thoughts before I let you go?
No, I would just reiterate that it's a very interesting time in world history, and you see so many things at play around the world. And again, I think it speaks to how the world is getting smaller and smaller relative to our ability to communicate on an instant basis around the world, to move our assets around the world, and because there's lots of things going on in the world right now, Christina, that all have some impact on the United States.
It's certainly something that we're going to keep our eye on heading into next week and those conversations, monitoring it all for you here on Live Now from Fox. Hopefully, Brian will join us again next week to help us break down the very latest after all of that concludes. Thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely, Christina. Have a great rest of the day.
You too. Have a good weekend.